Good evening and welcome. Tonight's story takes place in the United States and centers on a small and private spiritual group known as Heaven's Gate. For many years, the group existed quietly, outside public attention, moving between ordinary homes and everyday neighborhoods, and leaving very little trace beyond its own internal community. This episode is told only through confirmed police records, official statements, and documented investigative findings. It does not rely on speculation, private interpretation, or unverified accounts. The focus remains on what authorities were able to establish and how institutions responded. Heaven's Gate was not a public movement in the way many religious or spiritual groups are. It did not seek political influence, public demonstrations, or large gatherings. Instead, it functioned through small numbers, close personal relationships, and carefully controlled internal communication. For much of its existence, it attracted little attention from law enforcement or public agencies. Members lived quietly, worked when necessary, and avoided contact with media. From the outside, there was little to distinguish the group from countless other small communities that share belief, study, and private practice. What later brought the group into national attention was not a long history of reported conflict with authorities, but a single, tightly contained event that required careful investigation and federal review. This story is not told to provoke fear or to sensationalize belief. It is told to understand how a closed community can operate within the ordinary structures of society, while remaining almost entirely invisible to public institutions. For many people who later learned about Heaven's Gate, one of the most difficult aspects to understand was how individuals with education, technical skills, and social experience became part of such a small and isolated organization. This episode does not attempt to answer that question through judgment. It approaches it through documented structure, leadership, daily life, and institutional response. The account you are about to hear does not focus on dramatic language. It avoids graphic description. It follows the quiet and procedural reality of how investigators approached the case, how evidence was handled, and how responsibility was understood through law and policy rather than through assumption. It is also important to note that this story is not about crime in the conventional sense of ongoing violence, financial exploitation, or public danger. It is about how authorities respond when a closed group comes to attention suddenly, and how institutions attempt to understand an internal world that had previously remained entirely private. Throughout this episode, belief itself is not treated as a problem. Freedom of belief and association remains a protected part of democratic society. The focus rests instead on organizational structure, internal authority, and the practical realities of investigation, when very little information exists outside the group. Much of what was later learned about Heaven's Gate came not from long-term surveillance or public reporting, but from careful reconstruction after the fact. Investigators were required to rely on documents, personal records, digital material, and official interviews to understand how the group functioned and how its internal life had been organized. For families connected to members of the group, the public story that followed was often very different from the private experience that came before. In many cases, relatives had little knowledge of how deeply involved their loved ones had become, or how much of their daily life had shifted into a closed internal world. For public institutions, the case raised difficult questions about visibility, responsibility, and the limits of early intervention. When a group operates quietly, legally, and without outward disruption, there are very few mechanisms that allow authorities to become aware of internal change. This episode follows the development of the group, the way authority and discipline were structured, and how law enforcement and federal agencies responded once the situation became known. It does so slowly and with care. You will not hear dramatic reconstruction. You will not hear unverified theories. Every part of this account is grounded in confirmed investigative material and official reporting. As you listen, there is no need to hold every detail closely. This is a calm, documentary narrative designed for quiet attention and late-night listening. Tonight, we begin with a small spiritual community that existed largely unseen, and with the careful work of institutions that were later required to understand what had taken place inside a world that had been intentionally private. And so, as the night settles around you, we begin with a group that left very little behind, and a story that could only be told after it had already become part of public record. In the 1970s, life in the United States was shaped by rapid social change, cultural uncertainty, and a growing distance between many people and long-established institutions. Political trust had weakened, traditional religious participation was declining in many regions, and public confidence in large organizations no longer carried the same certainty it had in earlier decades. For a growing number of people, this period encouraged a more personal approach to belief and identity. Instead of turning to churches or formal religious structures, individuals increasingly explored spirituality through private study, small group gatherings, and personal experimentation. Belief became less connected to inherited tradition and more closely tied to individual experience and self-development. Across cities and suburban communities, discussion groups, meditation circles, and informal spiritual meetings became common. Some were organized around Eastern philosophy, some around personal transformation and self-awareness, and others around ideas connected to science, technology, and the possibility of life beyond Earth. These movements were often small, decentralized, and largely invisible to public institutions. This shift was not limited to people experiencing social or financial instability. Many participants were professionally employed, technically skilled, and socially connected. Engineers, students, healthcare workers, and business professionals could be found attending lectures and informal gatherings focused on consciousness, alternative knowledge, and future-oriented belief systems. A key feature of the period was the merging of spirituality with language drawn from science and technology. Public interest in space exploration, astronomy, and emerging digital technologies shaped how belief was expressed. For some groups, ideas about the future of humanity, advanced intelligence, and unseen dimensions of reality became part of spiritual discussion rather than scientific debate alone. Another important influence was the growing emphasis on self-improvement and personal responsibility. Books, seminars, and workshops promoted emotional discipline, mental clarity, and the idea that individuals could reshape their lives through focused inner work. Spiritual development was often described as a practical process rather than a religious obligation. At the same time, informal networks became easier to maintain. Travel within the country was increasingly accessible, and personal connections across different states allowed small communities to grow without needing permanent public locations. Groups could meet briefly, relocate, and reform elsewhere with little administrative visibility. Public authorities and social institutions rarely monitored these activities. The meetings were legal, private, and usually peaceful. Freedom of belief and association remained strongly protected, and there was little reason for law enforcement or regulatory bodies to take interest in small spiritual communities that did not generate complaints or public disturbance. This environment created space for highly individualized spiritual movements to develop quietly. Some remained loosely organized and short-lived. Others gradually developed stronger leadership structures and more defined internal identities. The difference between a discussion group and a closed organization often emerged slowly, through personal relationships rather than formal rules. For many participants, these communities offered something meaningful. They provided structure during a time of uncertainty, connection during social change, and a sense of purpose that felt absent from mainstream institutions. The atmosphere in such groups was often described as supportive, thoughtful, and focused on shared exploration rather than authority. It is within this wider cultural setting that small and private spiritual organizations were able to form and operate with little public attention. The rise of alternative belief in the 1970s was not unusual, and it was not regarded as dangerous by default. It reflected a broader transformation in how people searched for meaning, community, and direction in a changing society. Understanding this background helps explain how a small, quiet group could later exist for years without attracting notice. The conditions that shaped spiritual life in the United States during this period made privacy, mobility, and informal organization not only possible, but entirely ordinary. The group that would later become known as Heaven's Gate began in the early 1970s through a personal and spiritual partnership between two individuals who met in the southern United States. One was Marshall Applewhite, a former university music professor with a background in education and performance. The other was Bonnie Nettles, a nurse with a strong interest in spirituality, astrology, and metaphysical belief. According to later investigative summaries and published court and law enforcement records, the pair came together during a period of personal transition and began developing a shared spiritual worldview. In its earliest form, the group did not operate under a fixed name or formal organization. Applewhite and Nettles traveled together and spoke publicly about spiritual awakening, personal transformation, and humanity's place in a wider cosmic order. Their talks were informal and were often hosted in community spaces, private homes, and small venues rather than through established institutions. During this early period, the movement functioned more as a traveling teaching partnership than as a structured group. Those who attended their presentations were invited to reflect on spiritual purpose, the limitations of material life, and the idea that deeper reality could be accessed through discipline and inner change. Contemporary reports and later reconstructions show that their message blended traditional religious language with ideas about extraterrestrial intelligence and higher levels of existence. This combination placed the group within the broader alternative spiritual culture that had become common in the United States during the 1970s. The pair initially attracted a small following of individuals who chose to continue traveling with them. These early followers formed the foundation of what would later become a more stable and committed membership. As the group developed, Applewhite and Nettles began to present themselves less as lecturers and more as spiritual guides. Their relationship with followers shifted gradually from teaching to leadership. Members began to view their guidance as essential to personal transformation rather than simply informative. By the mid-1970s, the group had begun to move regularly between different states. Members lived together for periods of time, often in temporary accommodation. There was still no central base, and the group avoided establishing permanent public facilities. During this phase, the organization remained deliberately small. Recruitment was selective rather than open. Individuals who expressed interest were observed over time and invited to participate more deeply only after extended personal contact. One of the defining features of this early development was the group's decision to withdraw from public outreach. After an initial period of public speaking and informal recruitment, the leadership shifted toward private meetings and internal training. The group stopped advertising events and became increasingly closed to outsiders. This change marked a significant turning point in the group's identity. What had begun as an outward-facing spiritual message gradually became an inward-focused community with its own internal language, routines, and expectations. Leadership roles also became more clearly defined. Applewhite emerged as the principal teacher and spiritual authority. Nettles remained closely associated with guidance and belief development during this period, and both were regarded by members as possessing unique spiritual roles. Internal records later examined by investigators confirmed that the group began to formalize daily routines. study practices, and behavioral standards. Members were encouraged to adopt a shared way of life that reflected the group's developing worldview. The organization's identity took shape through repeated movement, shared experience, and separation from outside influence. Without a fixed location, the group relied heavily on internal cohesion. Loyalty and trust became central to its stability. Following the death of Bonnie Nettles in 1985, the organization entered a new phase. Applewhite remained the sole leader and continued to guide the group's belief system and direction. Investigators later confirmed that Nettles' death led to important changes in how doctrine was interpreted and how leadership authority was expressed. Despite this transition, the group did not dissolve. Instead, it became more internally focused. Public visibility remained extremely limited, and recruitment continued to occur quietly through personal contact rather than through public events. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the movement had adopted the name Heaven's Gate. This name reflected the group's evolving belief about transition to a higher level of existence and reinforced a clear organizational identity that distinguished it from other informal spiritual networks. At this stage, Heaven's Gate had become a defined and closed organization. It possessed stable membership, a recognized leader, shared beliefs, and internal rules that shaped daily life, while still mobile and largely hidden from public view. It now functioned as a coherent community rather than a traveling spiritual partnership. From the outside, little was visible. There were no permanent public centers, no media presence, and no institutional affiliations. Yet inside the group, a structured identity had formed, built around authority, shared discipline, and a common understanding of spiritual purpose. The early development of Heaven's Gate, therefore, unfolded quietly. It was shaped not by public attention or organizational growth, but by personal leadership, gradual withdrawal from outside influence, and the slow formation of a private and committed internal community. Within Heaven's Gate, belief was presented as a disciplined path toward what members understood as a higher level of existence. According to official investigative summaries, court records, and verified internal material reviewed by authorities, the group's teachings combined spiritual language with ideas about extraterrestrial intelligence and human transformation. Members were taught that ordinary human life represented a temporary and limited state of being. Advancement was described as a process through which individuals could prepare themselves to move beyond the physical world and join a more advanced, non-human level of existence. This transition was framed not as symbolic belief, but as a real and future event that required careful personal preparation. The group referred to this future state as a higher evolutionary level. Members were encouraged to understand themselves as students in training rather than as followers of a religion. The emphasis was placed on discipline, learning, and personal change rather than worship or prayer. Spiritual development was defined through strict behavioral standards. According to verified internal guidelines reviewed during later investigations, members were expected to regulate emotional attachment, suppress personal ambition, and minimize expressions of individuality. Daily conduct was closely aligned with group expectations, and personal preferences were gradually replaced by shared routines and language. The group's doctrine also stressed separation from what it described as ordinary human influence. External relationships, including friendships and family ties, were not formally prohibited, but were considered distractions from spiritual preparation. Members were encouraged to reduce emotional dependence on people outside the group. Authority inside the organization was structured around a single spiritual leader. After the death of Bonnie Nettles, leadership was held entirely by Marshall Applewhite. Investigative material confirmed that members regarded Applewhite as a uniquely authorized guide whose role extended beyond teaching and into spiritual direction. He was not presented simply as an instructor. members were taught that Applewhite occupied a specific and necessary position within the spiritual framework of the group. His guidance was regarded as essential to the process of preparation and advancement. This form of authority was not enforced through written organizational rules. Instead, it was sustained through doctrine and repeated internal teaching. Members were reminded regularly that spiritual progress depended upon obedience to guidance and willingness to follow direction without hesitation. The internal hierarchy of the group was deliberately limited. There were no publicly recognized ranks or titles. However, court and investigative findings confirmed that informal seniority existed. Members who demonstrated long-term commitment and strict adherence to behavioral standards were entrusted with additional responsibility and closer access to leadership. These individuals assisted with daily coordination, communication, and the supervision of group activities. Their authority, however, remained derivative. All significant decisions and doctrinal interpretation were reserved to One of the defining elements of the group's belief system was the rejection of conventional identity. Members adopted new names and were encouraged to think of their former personal histories as irrelevant. This practice supported a sense of separation between life inside the group and life before membership. The doctrine also emphasized the importance of uniformity. Differences in opinion, lifestyle, or personal preference were described as obstacles to collective readiness. According to internal material later reviewed by investigators, conformity was framed as spiritual alignment rather than social pressure. Members were encouraged to monitor their own thoughts and behavior. Personal doubt was interpreted as a sign of incomplete discipline, rather than as a reason to question doctrine. Correction, therefore, took place primarily through self-regulation rather than through direct punishment. Leadership authority was reinforced through constant reference to spiritual mission. Members were taught that the group's purpose was not personal fulfillment, but participation in a collective transition that had significance beyond individual life. Investigators later noted that this belief system strengthened internal cohesion by linking identity, purpose, and obedience to a single spiritual framework. Loyalty to leadership was presented as loyalty to the mission itself. Importantly, Heaven's Gate did not encourage hostility toward society. Members were taught to avoid confrontation and to remain respectful toward others. The group's separation from the outside world was framed as spiritual necessity rather than as opposition. The absence of public ritual, external preaching, or visible organizational structure further reinforced the inward focus of the group. All meaningful activity took place within private settings and through internal communication. Authority within Heaven's Gate was therefore not maintained through threat or force. It was sustained through shared belief, constant reinforcement of doctrine, and the presentation of leadership as indispensable to spiritual success. By the time the group entered its final years, its belief system and authority structure had become tightly integrated. Doctrine defined behavior, behavior reinforced loyalty, and loyalty sustained a leadership model in which spiritual authority remained concentrated in a single individual. This framework would later shape how investigators and institutions attempted to understand the group's internal life, and how responsibility was interpreted through documented structure rather than through public appearance. Recruitment into Heaven's Gate did not follow the patterns commonly associated with public religious movements. According to verified investigative summaries and internal material reviewed by authorities, most individuals encountered the group through personal contact rather than public advertising or organized outreach. In the earliest years, potential members were introduced through small lectures and informal discussion meetings. These gatherings focused on personal transformation, spiritual discipline, and the idea that human life could be understood as part of a wider cosmic process. The language used in these meetings avoided institutional religion and instead presented belief as a form of learning and self-development. As the group gradually withdrew from public events, recruitment became increasingly selective. New participants were typically introduced through existing members who had established trust over time. Court and law enforcement records indicate that personal compatibility and willingness to adopt the group's lifestyle were considered more important than enthusiasm for the belief system itself. Commitment developed slowly. Individuals were not asked to abandon their personal lives immediately. Instead, they were invited to spend extended periods with the group, often through short-term travel or shared living arrangements. This allowed potential members to experience daily routines before making long-term decisions. Those who remained were gradually introduced to stricter behavioral expectations. Personal schedules became more structured. Daily activities were organized collectively. Members were encouraged to observe how senior participants managed emotion, communication, and self-discipline. Daily life inside the group was shaped by routine and simplicity. Members lived together in rented houses or temporary accommodation. They shared domestic responsibilities such as cooking, cleaning, and maintenance. Living conditions were modest, and personal possessions were kept to a minimum. Court and investigative findings confirmed that members generally did not maintain separate personal finances in the same way as before joining. Income from work, when it existed, was directed toward supporting the group's shared living expenses and operational needs. Financial arrangements were handled collectively under leadership direction. Work outside the group was limited and practical. In later years, members relied on small-scale technical and web-related services to support the group's needs. Employment was chosen primarily for its flexibility rather than for long-term career development. Daily schedules were organized around internal study, discussion, and discipline practices. Time was allocated for group meetings, reflection, and instruction. These sessions focused on maintaining emotional control, reinforcing shared understanding, and reviewing expectations for behavior. Members were encouraged to speak openly during internal discussions about personal difficulties, doubt, or emotional attachment. Guidance was provided by senior members and ultimately by leadership. These exchanges reinforced the idea that personal challenges were best addressed within the group rather than through outside support. Social life was almost entirely internal. Recreational activities, conversation, and emotional support took place within the group. Contact with family and friends outside the organization gradually became less frequent, not through formal prohibition, but through the increasing centrality of group life. Investigators later noted that everyday interactions reinforced group identity. Members used shared language and expressions that reflected doctrine and reinforced separation from ordinary social reference points. This created a sense of shared reality that became increasingly distinct from external life. Uniformity was also visible in appearance and conduct. Members adopted similar clothing styles and grooming practices that reflected simplicity and reduced emphasis on individual identity. This supported the group's wider rejection of personal status and distinction. Importantly, daily life did not involve constant direct supervision. Members were expected to regulate their own behavior according to internalized expectations. Correction occurred through group discussion and reflection rather than through formal punishment. As commitment deepened, personal autonomy decreased. Major decisions, including travel, employment, and personal relationships, were discussed collectively and aligned with leadership guidance. Members learned to interpret personal preference as secondary to group purpose. Investigative records show that this gradual shift in daily life was central to long-term commitment. Individuals did not experience an abrupt change. Instead, identity and routine were reshaped slowly through repetition and shared structure. By the time individuals became full members, daily life had become closely integrated with organizational expectations. Work, housing, social contact, and personal decision-making were no longer separate from group identity. From the outside, the group appeared quiet and unremarkable. There were no public gatherings, no visible signage, and no fixed institutional presence. Inside, however, everyday life functioned through carefully maintained routine, shared responsibility, and constant reinforcement of behavioral norms. Recruitment in daily life, therefore, formed a continuous process. People entered gradually, learned the rhythm of group life, and over time adapted to a way of living that placed collective purpose and spiritual preparation above individual independence. Within Heaven's Gate, isolation developed through gradual changes in how members were encouraged to think about trust, influence, and emotional connection. According to verified investigative material and internal documents later reviewed by authorities, separation from the outside world was framed as a practical and spiritual necessity, rather than as a rule. Members were taught that preparation for higher existence required careful control of emotional attachment. Relationships outside the group were not described as harmful, but as distractions that could interfere with discipline and focus. Over time, members were encouraged to reduce reliance on family and long-standing friends and to center their emotional support within the group. When personal difficulties arose, members were guided to discuss them internally rather than with external professionals or relatives. This practice gradually redirected trust towards senior members and leadership. Emotional reassurance and advice became closely associated with organizational authority. Information control was central to this process. Members were encouraged to rely on internal teaching and group discussion as their primary source of understanding. External books, media, and alternative spiritual material were generally discouraged, not because they were described as dangerous, but because they were believed to create confusion and weaken unity. Internal communication reinforced a shared interpretation of reality. According to investigative summaries, members were reminded regularly that only those who had committed to the group's discipline could fully understand its purpose. This distinction strengthened the idea that meaningful knowledge existed only within the organization. Over time, this approach altered how members evaluated criticism. Concern expressed by family members or outsiders was often interpreted as lack of understanding, rather than as legitimate warning. Members were encouraged to examine their own emotional reactions rather than the content of external feedback. Loyalty to leadership was framed as a practical requirement for spiritual readiness. Guidance from Marshall Applewhite was presented as essential to maintaining clarity and alignment with the group's purpose. Members were taught that individual interpretation could lead to error and that unity depended on shared understanding directed by leadership. This authority was not maintained through direct orders or punishment. It was reinforced through repeated internal teaching and group discussion. Members were reminded that trust in leadership reflected trust in the spiritual process itself. Self-monitoring became a defining feature of group life. Individuals were encouraged to observe their thoughts, reactions, and emotional responses, and to correct any impulses that conflicted with group expectations. Personal doubt was described as a sign that further discipline was required. Investigators later noted that this system created a form of internal regulation. Members learned to evaluate their own behavior against organizational standards and to adjust without external intervention. Information about internal practices, belief development, and group activity was treated as private. Members were discouraged from discussing internal matters with people outside the organization. This was framed as respect for shared commitment rather than secrecy. The gradual reduction of external contact was therefore accompanied by an increase in internal communication. Group discussions, shared routines, and collective reflection replaced informal social interaction. As internal relationships became more central, emotional dependence on fellow members and leadership deepened. The group became the primary environment for identity, support, and meaning. Court and investigative findings confirmed that the process was incremental. members did not experience immediate separation from their previous lives. Instead, priorities shifted gradually as time, energy, and emotional focus were increasingly devoted to the organization. Leaving the group was not formally prohibited. However, departure was described in internal language as an interruption of spiritual preparation. Former members were portrayed as individuals who had not completed the necessary discipline, rather than as people who had made a different choice. This narrative discouraged reconsideration of membership by framing withdrawal as personal failure rather than as a neutral decision. By the time members became deeply involved, relationships outside the group had often weakened naturally through lack of contact. Internal trust had replaced external support. Leadership guidance had replaced independent decision-making. Isolation within Heaven's Gate, therefore, did not arise through physical confinement or overt pressure. It emerged through the slow redefinition of trust, knowledge, and emotional security. Information control, internal communication, and spiritual authority worked together to create a closed environment in which loyalty to leadership and reliance on the group became central to daily life. Throughout its existence, Heaven's Gate remained a mobile and geographically flexible community. According to confirmed law enforcement records and later investigative summaries, the group did not establish a permanent headquarters or fixed public center. Instead, members moved between different states and lived for extended periods in rented houses and temporary accommodation. This pattern of movement served both practical and organizational purposes. The group relied on privacy and limited public visibility. Renting properties rather than purchasing permanent facilities allowed members to relocate quietly when circumstances changed, without creating a stable public footprint. Investigators later reconstructed a timeline showing that the group lived in several regions of the United States over the years, including parts of California, New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas. Moves were generally coordinated by leadership and carried out collectively rather than by individual decision. Housing arrangements were communal. Members lived together in shared residences, often occupying large rental homes that allowed group activities to take place privately. Living spaces were organized to support collective routines rather than personal comfort. Bedrooms were shared in practical ways, and common areas were used for meetings and instruction. Court and law enforcement records indicate that personal privacy within these homes was limited. The group placed greater importance on shared schedules and collective responsibility than on individual space. Domestic routines, including meals, cleaning, and maintenance, were organized cooperatively. Relocation decisions were communicated internally rather than publicly. Members were informed of upcoming moves and assisted with logistical preparation. Travel, packing, and transport were organized collectively, and leadership approval was required before individual members made changes to housing or location. Internal coordination across locations was managed through regular group meetings and private communication. Even when members were temporarily separated, leadership maintained contact to ensure consistency in routine and teaching. Investigators later confirmed that the group maintained detailed internal planning for travel and housing. Schedules, property arrangements, and shared responsibilities were communicated clearly within the group, ensuring that daily life could continue with minimal disruption after relocation. From an organizational perspective, the absence of a permanent base reduced administrative visibility. The group did not register public facilities, advertise addresses, or operate through established community institutions. This made it more difficult for outsiders to observe patterns of activity or to recognize the group as an organized movement. Despite frequent movement, internal organization remained stable. Leadership direction continued to define schedules, behavioral expectations, and daily practice, regardless of location. Members were encouraged to adapt quickly to new environments without questioning organizational decisions. Shared living arrangements also played a practical role in supporting the group's limited financial structure. Pooling resources reduced housing costs and simplified daily expenses. Investigators later confirmed that group funds were used to secure rental properties and to support travel. Internal roles were informal but consistent. Certain members handled technical tasks, communication, and logistical planning under leadership guidance. Others focused on maintaining domestic routines and coordinating daily activities. While responsibilities varied, authority remained centralized. The group's mobility, therefore, did not reflect instability or disorganization. It functioned as a deliberate operational model that supported privacy, flexibility, and internal control. From the outside, these shared houses appeared to be ordinary rented properties occupied by unrelated individuals. There were no visible signs of organizational identity. Neighbors and local communities generally had little awareness of the group's internal life. Inside, however, daily coordination was highly structured. Schedules were maintained. Meetings occurred regularly. Behavioral expectations remained consistent, regardless of location. This combination of physical mobility and internal stability allowed Heaven's Gate to operate quietly for many years. The group could move between states without drawing attention, while preserving a tightly organized internal environment that supported leadership authority and collective discipline. In late March 1997, authorities in the state of United States became aware of events connected to Heaven's Gate through information received by local law enforcement in California. According to confirmed police records, on the 26th of March 1997, officers from the San Diego County Sheriff's Department were requested to attend a large rented residence in Rancho Santa Fe, California. The request followed concerns raised after a former member of the group received a package and communication that caused alarm and prompted contact with authorities. When deputies arrived at the property, they made entry and began a welfare check. Inside the residence, officers discovered multiple deceased individuals. The scene was immediately secured, and the property was treated as a major investigation site. Law enforcement confirmed that 39 people were found deceased inside the house. All were identified as members of the same group. There were no signs of forced entry and no indications of external intrusion at the property. The Sheriff's Department publicly stated that the initial assessment showed no evidence of struggle inside the residence and no indication that any other persons were involved at the scene. Investigators established that the individuals had died over a short period of time, rather than simultaneously, based on physical evidence and time indicators at the scene. Authorities concluded that the deaths had occurred in several groups across a number of days. Police confirmed that the events took place between approximately the 22nd and the 26th of March 1997. This timeline was reconstructed using scene evidence, communication records, and environmental indicators inside the residence. The house itself was found to be organized and carefully arranged. Living areas and sleeping rooms showed clear preparation. Law enforcement later confirmed that the environment reflected planning and coordination rather than disorder. Investigators also recovered a significant amount of written material, video recordings, and digital files belonging to the group. These materials were secured as evidence and became central to the later investigative review. Among the recovered items were recorded messages made by group members shortly before their deaths. Authorities confirmed the existence of these recordings and reviewed them as part of the official inquiry. Law enforcement stated publicly that the content of the recordings and written documents demonstrated that the individuals understood what was about to occur and that the actions had been planned within the group. Importantly, investigators did not identify any evidence of criminal violence directed at the group from outside. There were no indications of intrusion, assault by non-members, or forced confinement. The Sheriff's Department formally classified the case as a mass death event involving members of a closed group. The investigation focused on confirming the identities of those involved, establishing the sequence of events, and determining whether any criminal offenses had occurred. Authorities confirmed that all individuals found in the residence were adults. The identities of the deceased were verified through documentation recovered at the scene and through coordination with family members and public records. Law enforcement also confirmed that the group had been living at the Rancho Santa Fe property for several months prior to the events. The house had been rented legally and was used as a shared residence. Investigators reconstructed the final days of group activity through computer records, calendars, and internal notes found inside the property. These materials showed that daily routines had continued in an organized manner during the final period. Authorities stated that the house had been prepared in advance for the final days. Supplies, equipment, and personal items had been arranged ahead of time. This preparation formed part of the conclusion that the events were not spontaneous. No evidence was found to indicate that any individuals were held against their will at the property. Investigators reported that there were no physical restraints, no locked exit points, and no signs of coercive confinement. The sheriff's department also confirmed that no children were present and that no other occupants were located elsewhere connected to the residence. During the early phase of the investigation, the property remained under continuous police control while forensic teams documented the scene and removed evidence for analysis. Public communication from authorities during this period was deliberately limited. Officials avoided releasing interpretive statements and focused on confirmed procedural facts. In the days following the discovery, law enforcement agencies confirmed that they had notified federal authorities, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, due to the scale of the incident and the interstate history of the group. Investigators also contacted law enforcement agencies in other states, where the group had previously resided, in order to confirm movement patterns and housing history. The official position of the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, following scene examination and evidence review, was that the deaths resulted from coordinated actions within the group, and that there was no evidence of homicide by an external party. This conclusion was based on physical evidence at the scene, recovered documentation, recorded communications, and the absence of any indication of outside involvement. Authorities emphasized that the investigation remained open during the evidence review phase in order to confirm that no criminal offenses had been committed by individuals outside the group and that no additional members were at risk. By the end of the initial investigation stage, law enforcement confirmed that all known members connected to the Rancho Santa Fe residence had been accounted for. The final period of Heaven's Gate, as established by official police records, therefore consists of a short and carefully coordinated timeline in which all confirmed activity took place within a single private residence and involved only group members. No public disturbances occurred at the time. No emergency calls were made from the property. The events became known to authorities only after external contact raised concern and prompted a welfare check. From an investigative standpoint, the significance of the case lay not in a prolonged police operation, but in the careful reconstruction of a closed group's final days using physical evidence, documentation, and verified communication records. This factual timeline, established through law enforcement and forensic review, remains the official account of how the final period of Heaven's Gate unfolded. Following the discovery of the deaths at the Rancho Santa Fe residence, the San Diego County Sheriff's Department immediately assumed control of the site and initiated a full investigative response. According to official law enforcement reports, the first priority was securing the property and establishing a controlled perimeter around the house. Access to the residence was restricted to authorized personnel only, and a formal crime scene log was created to record every entry and exit. Investigators treated the location as a potential crime scene from the outset, even though there were no immediate signs of outside involvement. Standard procedure required that all possibilities be preserved until evidence could be fully assessed. Specialist units were deployed to document the interior and exterior of the property. This included forensic investigators, scene photographers, and evidence technicians. Every room in the house was systematically examined and recorded before any items were removed. Authorities confirmed that each individual located inside the residence was documented in place prior to recovery. This process allowed investigators to reconstruct spatial layout and group organization without relying on later recollection. Environmental evidence, including household items, personal belongings, and equipment found throughout the property, was photographed and catalogued. Officers noted the deliberate and orderly arrangement of the living space as part of the scene assessment. Investigators collected all written materials, computer equipment, digital storage devices, and recorded media located inside the house. These items were secured and transferred to evidence facilities for later analysis. Computers and digital media were handled by specialist technicians trained in electronic evidence recovery. Law enforcement later confirmed that hard drives, data storage devices, and internal files were examined to reconstruct communication patterns and organizational activity during the final period. The residence itself was examined for signs of forced entry, structural damage, or tampering. Doors, windows, and external access points were checked. No indications of intrusion were identified. Investigators also reviewed the surrounding area. Neighbors were interviewed to determine whether any unusual activity, visitors, or disturbances had been observed in the days prior to the discovery. According to official summaries, no reports of conflict or emergency activity were received from the area during that period. Medical examiners and forensic pathologists were brought to the scene to begin formal examination and recovery procedures. The identification of individuals was conducted carefully, using documentation recovered at the property and later confirmed through official records and family notification. Throughout the early response phase, law enforcement agencies coordinated closely with the County Medical Examiner's Office. This ensured that recovery and examination followed established legal and medical protocols. All evidence collected from the property was labeled, sealed, and logged under standard chain of custody procedures. Investigators later emphasized that strict documentation was essential due to the scale of the case and the potential involvement of federal authorities. Public access to information was carefully managed. Press briefings were conducted away from the scene, and officers avoided releasing operational details that could compromise the investigation or invade the privacy of the deceased and their families. Within days of the initial discovery, representatives from federal agencies were briefed on the preliminary findings. This coordination allowed authorities to determine whether any interstate or federal offenses might be relevant to the case. Investigators also contacted law enforcement agencies in other states where members of the group had previously resided. Housing records, rental agreements, and prior police contact histories were reviewed to confirm the group's movements and residential patterns. The scene remained under law enforcement control for an extended period, while forensic and digital analysis continued. The length of the site examination reflected the need to process a large volume of material and to confirm the identities and roles of all individuals involved. Once the on-site investigation was completed, the property was formally released, and responsibility for continuing analysis transferred to investigative and forensic units working off-site. From an institutional perspective, the response to the scene was shaped by two priorities. The first was to determine whether any criminal offenses had occurred. The second was to establish a clear and reliable factual record of what had taken place inside a closed community, but had left very little public trace. The handling of the Rancho Santa Fe residence, therefore, became the foundation of the entire inquiry. The careful preservation of the scene, the systematic recovery of material, and the controlled release of information allowed authorities to move forward without relying on speculation or public narrative. The law enforcement response focused on documentation, verification, and restraint. Every decision made at the scene was guided by the requirement to preserve evidence, protect legal process, and ensure that the final account could be supported by confirmed investigative findings rather than assumption. Following the initial response by local authorities in California, federal agencies became involved in the review of events connected to Heaven's Gate due to the scale of the incident and the group's documented history of movement across multiple states. The primary federal agency consulted during the investigation was the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Its role was not to assume control of the case, but to support local and state authorities in reviewing evidence that could indicate violations of federal law or interstate criminal activity. From the outset, coordination between the San Diego County Sheriff's Department and federal personnel focused on information sharing and technical support. Federal agents assisted in reviewing digital material and communication records recovered from the residents, particularly where data storage and electronic communication were involved, because members of the group had previously lived and traveled in multiple states. Investigators were required to examine whether any offenses had occurred outside California that might fall under federal jurisdiction. This included reviewing prior housing arrangements, employment activity, and financial transactions that crossed state boundaries. Information coordination was managed through structured briefings and shared investigative summaries. Local investigators maintained responsibility for scene evidence and initial findings, while federal personnel assisted in building a wider organizational timeline. One of the central tasks during this phase was the consolidation of information held by different agencies. Law enforcement officers in states where the group had previously resided were contacted and asked to review any records connected to the group or its members. This included previous police contact, property rental records, and reports of welfare concerns. Federal agencies also assisted in reviewing travel and movement patterns to confirm the group's relocation history. This helped investigators establish a comprehensive view of how members had moved between states and how internal coordination had been maintained over time. The multi-agency review also extended to financial information. Federal and state investigators examined whether any financial offenses, fraud, or coercive practices had occurred that could fall within federal investigative authority. These inquiries were conducted through lawful access to banking and transaction records. Investigators later confirmed that no evidence was found to support charges relating to interstate fraud, financial exploitation, or organized criminal activity beyond the internal actions of the group itself. A further aspect of federal involvement concerned the examination of communication, material for any indications of external coordination, international connections, or third-party influence. Investigators reviewed electronic correspondence and stored documents to determine whether the group had received direction or assistance from outside entities. This review did not identify any external organizational involvement. Throughout this phase, authorities maintained a clear distinction between belief and potential criminal conduct. Federal officials emphasized that the investigation was limited to verifying whether any violations of law had occurred and did not involve assessment of doctrine or spiritual practice. The organization of the wider investigation relied on a structured division of responsibility. Local law enforcement remained responsible for the core case file and for public communication. Federal agencies provided analytical support, technical resources, and coordination assistance across jurisdictions. Regular case conferences were held to review findings, compare timelines, and ensure consistency in documentation. These meetings allowed investigators to resolve discrepancies and to confirm that all known information had been incorporated into a single evidentiary framework. Legal advisors from both local and federal offices were involved throughout the review. Their role was to ensure that investigative steps remained compliant with jurisdictional boundaries, and that any potential charges would be supported by admissible evidence. The multi-agency structure also allowed for rapid response to new information as it emerged during digital and documentary analysis. When previously unknown material was identified, relevant agencies were notified and asked to assess its relevance within their own records. By the conclusion of the federal review phase, investigators were able to confirm that the case did not involve wider criminal networks, external conspiracies, or interstate exploitation schemes. The events were determined to be confined to the internal organization and its members. This conclusion allowed the investigation to shift away from criminal inquiry toward institutional review and public reporting. From an operational perspective, the involvement of federal agencies provided technical depth and organizational clarity. It ensured that the investigation considered all plausible legal avenues while maintaining a disciplined and evidence-based approach. The coordinated review process also demonstrated how complex incidents involving closed and mobile communities require cooperation across multiple levels of law enforcement, even when ultimate responsibility remains with local authorities. In the case of Heaven's Gate, federal involvement therefore functioned as a supporting framework. It strengthened the factual foundation of the investigation and helped confirm that the official account rested on verified evidence rather than assumption or public speculation. When the deaths connected to Heaven's Gate became known, public communication was handled cautiously and almost entirely through formal law enforcement briefings. The responsibility for releasing verified information rested primarily with the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, which had led the initial response and scene investigation. Early statements focused on confirmed facts only, including the location of the residence, the number of people found inside, and the absence of any immediate evidence of outside involvement. Authorities avoided describing motives or belief in detail during the first public briefings. Officials explained that the investigation was still in its early stages and that conclusions would be based solely on physical evidence, documentation recovered at the scene, and verified communication records. This approach reflected an effort to prevent public misunderstanding during a period when limited information was available. Law enforcement representatives repeatedly stated that the primary purpose of early communication was to confirm public safety and to clarify that there was no indication of an ongoing threat to the surrounding community. As national and international media attention increased, officials continued to emphasize restraint in public commentary. Press conferences were structured around procedural updates rather than narrative interpretation. Investigators confirmed when evidence had been collected, when forensic work was underway, and when additional agencies had been consulted, but avoided offering personal views or speculative explanations. Public understanding of the case developed gradually through these controlled releases of information. The initial framing by authorities was consistent and deliberate. The event was described as a closed-group incident involving adults living together in a private residence, rather than as a criminal operation directed outward. When questions arose from journalists regarding belief, leadership, and internal structure, officials explained that those matters would be addressed only where they were directly supported by verified investigative findings. Statements were limited to what could be confirmed through documents, recorded material, and official examination. During this period, law enforcement agencies also took care to correct inaccurate reporting. When unverified claims or exaggerated figures appeared in media coverage, public information officers issued clarifications based on the official record. Authorities specifically addressed speculation about possible criminal networks, outside organizers, or hidden sponsors. Investigators confirmed that no evidence had been found to support involvement by external groups or individuals. This clarification became a repeated element of official briefings as public interest continued. Another area of public concern involved whether children or unwilling individuals had been present. Officials confirmed clearly and consistently that all individuals located at the residence were adults, and that no evidence of physical restraint or external coercion had been identified during scene examination. Public statements also addressed the question of prior law enforcement awareness. Officials explained that the group had not been under active criminal investigation before the incident, and that there had been no recorded pattern of complaints or public disturbances associated with the residents. This clarification was intended to explain why the case had not come to public attention earlier. Without suggesting oversight or failure, authorities framed the situation as one involving a private group operating lawfully and quietly until the discovery itself prompted investigation. Media reporting during this period reflected a wide range of interpretations and commentary. Some coverage focused on belief and ideology, while other reports concentrated on the personal backgrounds of members. Law enforcement agencies did not engage with these broader narratives and remained limited to procedural updates. Officials repeatedly reminded the public that interpretation of belief was not part of the criminal inquiry. Their statements emphasized that the investigation concerned verification of events and determination of whether any offenses had occurred under law. As the investigation progressed and federal review was confirmed, authorities announced this development in a brief and factual manner. The involvement of additional agencies was presented as a standard procedural step due to the size of the case and the group's history of interstate movement. The framing of the case by authorities remained consistent throughout. It was presented as a closed and contained incident, subject to formal investigation and institutional review, rather than as an ongoing criminal threat or public security crisis. This careful communication strategy had two central aims. The first was to protect the integrity of the investigation. The second was to avoid unnecessary public alarm or the creation of narratives that could not be supported by evidence. In later briefings, officials explained that much of the material recovered from the residence would require extended analysis, and that any public conclusions would be issued only after that process had been completed. For the families of those involved, communication was handled separately through private notification and support services. Authorities avoided releasing personal details beyond what was required for identification and public record. By maintaining a narrow and factual public message, investigators sought to separate confirmed findings from commentary and speculation. This distinction became an important feature of how the case was understood by the public over time. In this way, the official response to media coverage and public inquiry focused not on controlling narrative, but on protecting accuracy. The story presented by authorities remained procedural, limited, and deliberately quiet, allowing the investigative record to develop without pressure from public interpretation. In the months that followed the conclusion of the investigative review into Heaven's Gate, public institutions in the United States began a quieter and longer process of reflection. The case did not prompt the creation of new criminal laws, and it did not result in major changes to how belief-based communities are regulated. Instead, it influenced professional practice in more limited but practical ways, particularly in how authorities think about visibility, risk awareness, and interagency communication when closed communities operate without public contact. One of the most significant lessons identified by law enforcement agencies was the difficulty of recognizing risk when a group does not generate complaints, public disturbance, or criminal reports. Heaven's Gate had functioned for many years without drawing attention because its activities remained private, lawful, and largely self-contained. Investigators later noted that traditional indicators used to assess community risk are often based on external impact. Noise complaints, welfare reports, financial disputes, or public conflict usually form the first points of institutional awareness. In this case, none of those signals were present in a way that would normally trigger review. As a result, training and internal guidance in some police and safeguarding services began to place greater emphasis on understanding closed organizational structures, rather than focusing only on visible behavior. Professionals were encouraged to consider how influence, authority, and emotional dependence can operate quietly inside private communities, without creating immediate external harm. Another important area of reflection involved information sharing. During the review process, authorities recognized that although no warning signs had been missed in a formal sense, there were limited mechanisms for connecting small and unrelated pieces of information across different regions and agencies. Following the case, several law enforcement and public safety bodies strengthened internal procedures for recording and reviewing unusual but non-criminal contact. This included welfare inquiries, background checks, and community information that does not meet the threshold for investigation, but may still contribute to a broader institutional picture over time. The emphasis of these changes was not surveillance, it was continuity. Agencies sought to ensure that institutional memory could be maintained even when personnel change and when cases remain inactive for long periods. Safeguarding professionals also examined how support services are offered to individuals who leave closed communities. While Heaven's Gate did not involve survivors in the conventional sense, the case highlighted the challenges faced by people who exit highly structured belief systems. Training guidance in social services and community support organizations began to place more attention on the psychological and social impact of long-term involvement in closed groups. Practitioners were encouraged to recognize that reintegration may involve loss of identity, reduced social networks, and difficulty rebuilding independent decision-making. The case also contributed to professional discussion around the limits of early intervention. Public institutions reaffirmed that belief and lifestyle choices alone cannot justify official involvement. At the same time, the case reinforced the importance of welfare-based responses when individuals appear isolated, emotionally dependent, or disconnected from external support systems. In practical terms, this led to greater emphasis on referral pathways rather than enforcement. When concerns are raised about individuals who may be part of closed or highly controlled communities, agencies are encouraged to prioritize access to mental health services, counseling, and voluntary support rather than criminal processes. Another institutional lesson concerned the handling of digital material. The volume of electronic data recovered during the Heaven's Gate investigation demonstrated how much internal activity can exist entirely within private communication systems. Following the case, specialist digital forensics training became more integrated into major incident response planning. Agencies sought to ensure that future investigations involving closed groups could manage large volumes of personal and organizational data lawfully and efficiently. The role of public communication also formed part of the review. Authorities reflected on the value of restrained and factual messaging during highly sensitive cases. In this instance, limiting public interpretation helped prevent the spread of misinformation and reduced pressure on investigative teams during a complex and emotionally charged inquiry. Institutional reviews highlighted that the careful separation between confirmed facts and public commentary supported public trust, even when many questions could not be answered immediately. Importantly, the case did not lead to changes in how religious or spiritual groups are formally monitored. Officials across multiple agencies made clear that freedom of belief and association remains a protected and fundamental principle. No new powers were created to observe private communities solely on the basis of ideology. Instead, the long-term impact of the case has been mainly professional rather than legislative. It has influenced how officers, safeguarding workers, and public service staff think about closed social environments and how subtle patterns of isolation and internal authority can shape daily life without appearing in public records. The investigation also became part of internal training and case study programs. It is now referenced as an example of how complex incidents can involve no external criminal network, no public warning signs, and no prior law enforcement contact, yet still require a large-scale and multi-agency response. For institutions, one of the central lessons was humility. The case demonstrated that not all risks can be anticipated through existing systems, and that public protection must operate within clear legal boundaries, even when outcomes are difficult to accept. The long-term impact of the Heaven's Gate case, therefore, rests less in policy reform and more in professional awareness. It has shaped how future cases involving closed and private communities are approached, documented, and reviewed in quiet and practical ways. It has contributed to a broader understanding that safeguarding in modern society often depends not on intervention, but on attentiveness, continuity, and the careful handling of limited information over time. As the night grows quieter, the story of Heaven's Gate begins to rest in a different way. It is not a story that can be fully understood through one moment or one decision. It is a story shaped by time, routine, and the slow formation of trust inside a private world. For many years, the group lived without public attention. Members moved between ordinary homes. Daily life continued quietly. There were no public gatherings, no outward disputes, and no visible signs that would normally draw institutional notice. From the outside, there was very little to see. Inside the group, however, meaning was built carefully. Belief offered structure, shared discipline offered certainty, and belonging offered a sense of place in a world that often felt uncertain and fast-moving. The people who joined were not defined by a single background or shared experience. They were individuals searching for clarity, purpose, and understanding. Their decision to step into a closed community was not sudden. It unfolded through repeated contact, trust, and a gradual shift in how life was organized. This is one of the quiet realities of closed communities. They rarely appear fully formed. They develop through everyday choices, small adjustments, and relationships that feel supportive and safe at the time. For public institutions, the case remains a reminder of how limited visibility can be when groups operate lawfully and privately. Systems designed to protect society depend on information that can be seen, reported, or shared. When daily life happens almost entirely inside a closed circle, there is little opportunity for early awareness. At the same time, the story also reflects the importance of restraint. Democratic societies are built on the protection of belief, association, and private life. Authorities cannot and should not intervene simply because a group appears unusual or different. This balance between freedom and safeguarding is not simple. The case of Heaven's Gate does not offer a clear rule for how that balance should always be drawn. What it offers instead is a quiet understanding of how authority and trust can become concentrated in ways that remain invisible to those outside. For the families of those who were involved, the years before the events were often marked by distance rather than conflict. Relationships changed slowly. Communication became limited. Explanations became difficult to share. These experiences unfolded privately, long before public attention arrived. For investigators and professionals who later reviewed the case, the focus was not on judging belief. It was on understanding structure, influence, and the practical realities of how a closed community functioned. In many ways, the most lasting lesson of this story is not about ideology. It is about belonging. Belonging can offer comfort. It can offer identity. It can offer stability. But when belonging becomes the only source of meaning, and when guidance becomes inseparable from authority, independence can quietly fade. Tonight, there is no need to resolve those tensions. This story does not end with certainty. It ends with reflection. It rests in the understanding that closed communities do not exist apart from society. They grow within it. They reflect the same needs for connection, purpose and understanding that exists everywhere else. As the night settles and the pace of the day softens, the story of Heaven's Gate returns to its place in public record. Professional memory and quiet institutional learning, not as spectacle, not as warning spoken loudly, but as a gentle reminder that trust, belief, and belonging are powerful human forces, and that their influence often unfolds in silence. For now, you can allow this story to fade gently into the background, and as the night deepens, you can let the quiet carry you forward into rest.